Welcome to today's Remote Works Evolving Landscape webinar sponsored by the College of Labor and Employment Lawyers. Before we plunge in, I want to urge you to look through at the tab for when you signed up for the handouts link. That's important for the handouts that we have that are very interesting in relation to today's topic. It's also important for CLE credit. The form that you need to fill out for CLE credit is in the handouts tab, and the email address that you need to send it to get CLE credit is at the bottom of that form. I will remind you again of this later, and we will read a CLE code later in the broadcast. As I said, our topic today is Remote Works Evolving Landscape. And I'm thrilled to have our co-panelists today because I think they really will contribute to this topic. Kathleen Bogus of Bogus and Conscious, she's the founding partner, and it's in a suburb of Detroit, and she's a former NELA president. So obviously she does plaintiff side work. She also serves as a mediator. I've had the pleasure, yes, the pleasure of being on the opposite side of the V from her because I found her to be incredibly thoughtful and really to get to the heart of the matters in a collegial way and an effective way. And I'll also note, because I'm trying to share with you the full nature of the perspectives of each of our panelists, that her daughter worked at a management side law firm and now works in-house on the employment side. So Kathy has a pretty expansive view of things. Christy Angelo, who now works in-house at the Consolidated Edison Company of New York. That's our utility here. He has been on the management side largely his whole career focused on that, but when he worked at a smaller law firm, he did some plaintiff side work. He also happens to be the chair of the New York State Bar Association's Labor and Employment section, of which I'm a member. So he's our fearless leader there. And one thing, when looking for an in-house counsel representative for this panel, I was looking for a company that has some workers who need to be on site all of the time, no matter what, as well as some who don't necessarily need to be on site all of the time. And at a utility, it's a quintessential example of that kind of employer. And last but not least, among the co-panelists other than myself, we are thrilled to have Dean David Lopez. He's the co-dean of Rutgers Law School. He also, many of you know him from being the longest tenured general counsel of the EEOC during the Obama administration. So starting with that, obviously, when he was the general counsel at the EEOC, he had a certain position that he was taking, and we'll get into that. For example, we're going to cover EEOC versus Ford, a Sixth Circuit case that David said he still got an axe to gore on a handful of years later. But what's also interesting is he's now a professor, he's an academic, but he also is co-dean. He's essentially a quintessential employer representative. So he has this fulsome set of perspectives to share as well, and I think that will be really interesting. And I'm Lauren Gazinski of Seyfarth Shaw. I've been practicing on the management side virtually all of my 30-year career, except early in my career, I did a year and a half on the plaintiff side. So that's part of my perspective as well. Later, we will get into specific legal issues raised by remote work in connection with reasonable accommodations, disparate impact, wage and hour, and potential subjection to unanticipated jurisdictional requirements, such as for tax and workers' compensation. But first, I want to ask each of you, starting with David, what you're seeing as the evolving pluses and minuses of remote work, not just legally, but also socially.
Great, thank you. It's a real pleasure to be here, and that is correct. People never see me as a management side person, but I think both at the EEOC and now as Dean in Rutgers Newark, I have management side responsibilities. I think the first thing I want to mention is that it's really important to keep this conversation in perspective and understand that only 30% of the workforce is working remotely, and that there are large segments of the workforce who are not able to telework, and that there are racial disparities, that African Americans and Latinos are much less likely to telework. And so we see this sort of evolving inequality and sort of a caste system. And I just want to make sure that we have this conversation in that perspective. I think, some of the things that we're seeing, and I've talked to a lot of people, is that people are just working more, right? I think with remote work, from a strictly billable perspective, people are actually working more and working more intentionally. People aren't jumping on the path to go to work. People aren't fighting traffic on the commute. People aren't having coffee clutches and lunches with their colleagues. People aren't checking in on the weekend or whatever on the Emmy Awards, and the communication is very intentional. And what that means is that I think that we're seeing, in many sense, a loss of magic and a loss of serendipity and a loss of energy in the workplace that, depending upon the type of work you're doing, could be very significant in terms of what you're doing. We're obviously seeing the boundaries blurred between home and work. I think for me, one of the lovely things is to see all the kids jump in on the various Zoom calls and Zoom meetings that we have. But I think it's really important because I think it highlights awareness about the challenges facing all of our caregivers. So I think that's some of the general things that we're seeing. I think people are dressing worse. They're not spending time on it. I don't know if I could get my ties on anymore because my remote office at home is in the kitchen. So I just keep eating food. But I just think, it really is a major transformation, and it's probably going to be a permanent one. I know we're going to talk more about some of the legal issues under the ADA and Title VII, but that's sort of my take.
Well, now, and David, just sticking with you for a minute, other than the loveliness of seeing the children pop into the video conference on occasion, is there any other water in the glass from your perspective on potential pluses of the remote work in this period?
I mean, I think it really depends on the person. I think it actually works for many people. I think certainly to the extent that, that there are, children that are learning remotely. I mean, I think it works. I think, it works with respect to certain people who may have, ADA disabilities. I think it works for everybody because no one likes commuting. So anyone who has a long commute, anyone who has the torture of jumping on the subway from Brooklyn to Newark knows that they're not missing that. I don't think anyone's missing the commute. I think we miss the liveliness of the world. But I think that we have undoubtedly seen, in a very strict sense, probably increases in productivity because I think people are cutting out a lot of the things that would sort of jump into the workday. And I think we're going to talk about whether that's good, because some of those things that may not be real tangible may be, depending upon where you're working, very essential to what you're doing. And that includes, law firms, and certainly includes educational institutions.
Thank you. Kathy, from your perspective?
Well, I think there are positives. I think the negatives overall, having remote work forced upon somebody, they probably, especially under the pandemic, they outweigh the positives. But the positives, people are saving money. They're not spending money on food by going out to lunch. They're not spending money on commute or time on commute. They're not spending money on work clothes. We'd have people stand up and see what we're wearing underneath our tops to prove that. But and people have more fluid schedules. However, I heard a study on the radio, so this weekend, as a matter of fact, so I tracked it down out of Harvard, and it shows that employees are working longer. They're working, an average workday lasts 45.8 minutes more. We have people who are attending, they say 13% more meetings. The emails, they are sending a much larger amount of emails to more people. But the problem with that is that everybody, our clients and we expect instant responses. Now that we think everybody is hunkered down and captive in their home, we expect, they're going to respond to our emails and our text messages immediately, no matter what the day, time, or whatever. And people are receiving, and we'll talk about this later with wage and hour, but some supervisors or owners of companies, all the time has just blended together, and the days have blended together. So they don't know where workday starts and workday stops. And so they impose this on their employees. And of course, if you are economically able, remote is probably very good because you can have a designated area if you live in a large house, if you live in a smaller place, and your bedroom is your office. It's very difficult to work in those situations. With the pandemic and the home education, there's a lot of issues because parents have to make decisions between working or taking care of their kids. And we'll talk more about that in the disparate treatment area. But there's quite a few negatives, and we all have to adjust because we were thrown it coming, didn't see to prepare for it. So even 6 months later, we're still learning how to maximize the best productivity. But I am worried about people's thoughts that they're online, on call 24/7, and that's not a healthy situation. I mean, people used to go to work and they could decompress on the trip home. And then when they get home, they can be there for their family. They have dinner, they have family time. If they want to work some more, that doesn't exist anymore. And that can be a problem for workers.
And Kathy, off of 2 points you made about space and home education are examples you gave. One fascinating study that I saw came from a large national commercial real estate broker, and it was counterintuitive because it reported that baby boomers were expressing the greatest satisfaction and sense of productivity in working remotely, particularly from home, and that the youngest generations in the workforce were the ones expressing the most frustration and sense of trouble. Now, that would seem counterintuitive because we think, there are assumptions made about the tech savvy of the younger generations versus the older, and that might be true. But when they dug beneath these numbers, what they found was that two things. One, if you're at a point in your life where you can afford more space and the space is more comfortable, you can have better Wi-Fi, you can maybe have a separate home office. I have to be in my colorful daughter's bedroom in my Manhattan apartment, but we're privileged to at least have that. So space matters. The other thing that matters is, are you at a point in your life where you have responsibilities for others? And if you're and I think that David referenced this too. If you're responsible for the home education of a young child who's antsy and having to do remote education, if you have to care for an elderly parent, things like that, that's a very different circumstance from being at a point in your life where you only have to worry about yourself. So I thought that was a really fascinating study. Chris, why don't you jump in with some, beyond what's already been said, at some other perspectives from the in-house?
Sure, Lauren, thanks a lot. One of the pluses is that I discovered today that tying a tie is like riding a bike, which is good. It's my first tie in about 6 months. But let me focus on some of the pluses, if you don't mind. And I work for a very safety conscious company, and there are actually some pluses associated with all of this that are helpful. And one is that very early on in January, in fact, and actually this goes back 10 years, during the H1N1 crisis, before I was there, we started a pandemic team. So when this type of situation would arise, we'd be ready to go. And our pandemic team this year was activated in January of 2020. So we were getting ahead of this as events were occurring in real time. And that allowed us to do a lot of things. We had practice remote work days, which were very helpful in terms of determining what our bandwidth capabilities were going to be with respect to accessing our network. We were encouraging more people to start working from home sooner rather than later. And then as we had another mandatory remote workday scheduled for March 12th. So I remember very vividly, quite frankly, that I went home on March 11th and I told my team, well, I'll probably take off Friday as well, but you'll see me next week. I haven't been back to the office ever since. But the point of all of this is, Lauren, that we were ready, and I believe a lot of employers were getting ready, but we were ready from a safety perspective in terms of being able to transition from a predominantly go to work environment to a work from home environment, which was very, very, very helpful for us. And it gave us the ability to weather the storm, especially in that March, April timeframe, the ability to weather the storm with respect to how the virus impacted our workforce. And it also has allowed us the time to pay attention to our physical plants, not just down in New York City, but in the Bronx and Westchester, Rockland, and Orange counties, et cetera, to create a safer work environment internally as well. We also focused externally. We did a lot of things with our field workforce, who are essential workers, to try to protect them. We cut down on certain types of services that we didn't deem to be essential, even though we had essential workers doing that work. For those individuals who had to perform services either on an emergency basis or in preparation for the summer months, we put some rules in place that were cost us some money, but were very beneficial to the employees. We would have teams early, pre-COVID, we would have teams go out in vehicles, 2 or 3 individuals per vehicle. We implemented a rule, 1 per vehicle, one individual per vehicle. We have since relaxed that a little bit, but now if there's more than 1 individual in the vehicle, everybody has to wear a mask. But in terms of safety, this time period has given us the opportunity to really prepare and assess what we were doing, how we were doing it, and try to make it as safe as possible for our employees.
And Chris, we talked in preparation when we talk about maybe additional return to on-site work, and David had mentioned, hey, not having to commute is a big deal. But you've had essential workers who had to commute the whole time. And one interesting thing, 3 of us are in the New York metropolitan region. We didn't have as much geographic diversity as might be ideal, but Kathy at least is serving in that function. Because of a fear of taking public transportation right now, and maybe you can elaborate on this, if I understand correctly, your employees who were commuting in early in the pandemic, their commutes were easier, but because more people are going back to on-site work, but far less people are using public transportation, their commutes have become worse than ever. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's been our experience. In terms of people who were, we back up early on in the pandemic, yeah, nobody was using public transportation. Nobody was driving in. Everybody was working from home. If you had to go to work, the trains were empty, the subways were empty, the buses were empty, and the roads were empty. So it was very easy. A commute that would normally take 90 minutes to drive in was taking about 30 to 40 minutes. So that time frame was really being cut short. Now, because more and more people are going back into New York City, our experience has been, and this is both anecdotal with respect to the company and anecdotal with respect to people I interact with in my town. People are still shying away from public transportation in a significant way. The roads are really backed up. So now that hour or 90-minute commute may take even longer to get into the city. than that 60 to 90 minute period. And then you have to deal with trying to find a parking spot as well. So that's been more difficult as the pandemic has gone on.
That makes total sense. David, I know that the issue of telework as a reasonable accommodation was a focus of yours while the general counsel at the EEOC. Can you explain your perspective? And I mentioned EEOC versus Ford. Can you explain your perspective on this issue?
Yeah, no, and it's a little bit more complicated. I know that when you reached out to me to do this panel, I said only if I can grind my axe about EEOC versus Ford. But I think you know from some of our conversations that I think my views are a little bit more nuanced. But certainly EEOC versus Ford, which was a Sixth Circuit and bonk decision, you know, still goes down as one of the biggest heartbreaks during my time as general counsel, because it was very closely divided court. We had won at the panel and then lost in bonk. And, you know, at issue in that case was a employee who was a resale agent at Ford. She had IBS, and she asked to work at home up to 4 days a week as a reasonable accommodation. Ford had a telework plan. Other workers were teleworking. The plan said that telework was a right and not a privilege. And you know, and it went up. And you know, I think there were three things that really troubled me about the decision. One is, and you know, this is I'm a plaintiff side lawyer here, but it's really the misapplication of summary judgment standards, sort of crediting the employer's testimony but not the employee's testimony. Kathleen understands all about what I'm talking about, and I'm not going to talk about that. You know, just sort of like, no, that's not what summary judgment is about. But I think the other two things is that the court said that you know, really credited the employer's argument that teamwork on site was an essential function of the job, and basically said and did say most jobs require teamwork, personal interaction, and supervision cannot be done in the home office situation. So they just basically just stated that most jobs that require any type of teamwork really require that you actually come in. And then the other thing that the court did that I thought was troubling was that it talked about technology and said, look, the OC didn't really put any evidence on the record that technology has changed. And so we're not going to really talk about changes in technology in terms of what's possible and what's not possible. But I think by that time, you know, everyone who read the decision, certainly, you know, who had been working in the workplace, and I don't know if these judges were really familiar with the workplace, understood that there was already teleconferencing capabilities and video conferencing capabilities at the time. And then, you know, the court said, you know, and to me this is a little bit dogmatic, but said, look, if we credit the fact that the company had a telework policy and use that as a fact against the company, then it's basically a situation of never let a good deed go unpunished. Again, the workplace in 2014, you know, employers were providing telework as sort of a way to recruit people to the company. And, you know, certainly I work with the younger population in the law school, and it's something that people were already asking. It's like, do you permit teleworking? And then the other thing is that, and we're seeing this now in terms of the fallout from COVID, is that it's a way to save on office space. So it wasn't just a good deed, it was good business for the employers. And so, you know, when the pandemic hit, I started to get text from the lawyer who worked on that saying, don't you feel vindicated because everyone's teleworking all over the country. We're seeing what's possible. People were working harder. I think that's one of the undisputed facts, you know, that productivity is probably up. And that we've seen, you know, out of necessity of this, from this horrible pandemic, the reality of what can be done with telework. And I'm like, yes, I feel vindicated. I have an axe to grind. I want to write an article on it. But here's the but. Here's the but. And understand this is coming from someone who is in an academic institution, and we are completely remote this year. And you know, and I think that all of us in the academic institution are really missing sort of the energy of the interaction with the students, with each other, and what I would call serendipity, right? What I would call the sort of magic that sort of happens when you talk to your colleagues about certain ideas. Now, this is an academic institution, but let me take it to a law firm, right? Like if you're at a law firm, you know, you have your requirements. I'm sure it's safer to bill a certain amount of hours, but you walk into each other's office, right? What about this? What about that? What do you think about this? And sometimes the conversations start with, you know, what did you think about, you know, whatever show is hot at that time? And they turn into something that kind of takes you in unexpected directions. So I think if you're basically a fan of GPS and you like to know where you're going and how to get there, telework is probably okay. But if you're someone who says that there's actually some joy in getting lost in the world, finding a bookstore, going in there looking for something, and then finding out something else, and we all know that experience, and that's an experience, that's a workplace experience. The problem that I'm running into is it sounds really new age to kind of talk about what I think people are missing in the workplace. I'm missing the energy, I'm missing the vibe, I'm missing the magic, I'm missing the fun. And so even though I think we all, and I say this on this call because we've had this conversation, know that we're missing something, how do you kind of articulate it? And I'm not saying it's an essential function of the job. Ford was wrongly decided. I still regard it as a big heartbreak, but I think that we all are missing something. I think, you know, regardless of where you work, there's something about being in the office, you know, certainly in the legal profession, that is really important to your job. And the question is, how do you articulate what that is? And so those are sort of my thoughts on Ford. By the way, the EOC pushed out a technical assistance guidance on the pandemic and the ADA. And this is really a reflection of existing guidance. I think it's pretty good. And it talks about, and, you know, we may go into this a little bit further. It talks about what the obligations will be, you know, when the pandemic ends, if it ends, right? And what this whole work at home situation means on the accommodation issue. I probably would have phrased it slightly different because it says, you know, it doesn't necessarily trigger obligations, but I think that we're all learning. It's all part of the zeitgeist. Now I'm arguing against myself. It's all part of the zeitgeist that we see what's possible. And I think once we've done this, it's going to really be hard to say that, oh no, we need people to come in for teamwork. We need people to be in there in the office. So I know I made two arguments against myself, but that's sort of my point, that I'm not just an axe grinder. I'm also someone who's just trying to figure this out, both as a manager and as someone who's running an academic institution.
Right, and David, when we were talking before this panel, you did elucidate, I thought, pretty clearly from a employer's perspective. If you're trying to make the case that something is an essential job function, you had kind of a global way of sort of approaching that issue. Do you want to comment on that?
I don't really remember what I said.
Okay. Yeah, I think
if you put a monkey in front of an easel, sometimes they'll come up with something that's art.
I think you were talking about looking to purpose and looking to the purpose of the job.
Yeah.
But then also taking that purpose focus and focusing on the purpose of on-site and how that purpose for the on-site serve the purpose of the job. And that's
right.
my notes.
Yeah, and so I think, you know, an academic institution might be the easier case because, you know, the students are missing the conversation outside, the faculty's missing the conversations in the faculty lunchroom. A law firm may be just a slight step over from that, because I think, you know, I think many people appreciate the collegiality and the importance of that aspect in the practice of law. But I can certainly, you know, imagine certain positions where you're basically, you know, either keeping the books or doing something that is really a more solitary function, where I think some of what we're talking about with respect to the purpose and with respect to the teamwork is not as critical.
That makes sense. And
can I jump in?
Of course, Kathy.
You say that about the bookstore and going into a bookstore and you don't find, you know, you like to look for other books. Remember before we had computer legal research, and
Yeah.
we would be in the libraries and we would find cases that we wouldn't find through computer legal research. So that just sort of reverberated. Yeah. But, oh,
I try to explain that to the students and they don't, yeah.
And off of what David was talking about for everybody on this call, the handouts include the full EEOC versus Ford Sixth Circuit decision and an article I co-wrote on the EEOC's recent technical assistance with a link to that technical assistance, an article from the University of Pennsylvania on the issue, and also to David's point, kind of, and my point earlier about the multiple perspectives we have, the two of the things that I've been published in recently are that update on the technical assistance, in which I took a management position of essentially lauding, and it's a simplification, but basically saying the EEOC is saying is rebutting what was out there in the ether, that there'd be a presumption that if somebody was doing telework during the pandemic, that they should be able to do telework after the pandemic. And the EEOC, in simplified terms, said that there's not a presumption of that it's an individualized assessment, just like it was beforehand. And there could be good reasons why an employer would temporarily, out of necessity or for other reasons, temporarily put on hold some essential function, and then later want that essential function to spring back to life. So from a management perspective, we thought that technical assistance was very helpful. And for those of you that have been following these college nationwide webinars closely, Commissioner Vicki Lipnick had essentially said what the technical assistance would say in a webinar on here about 6 weeks ago. So you shouldn't have been surprised. On the other hand, I was quoted in a Law 360 article. I co-chair our diversity and inclusion action team in our New York office, and I'm the co-founder of our All Abilities Affinity Group, which I'm proud to say was either the first or the second of its kind at a large law firm in the country. And I believe passionately in the issue. And for people, for example, with the kinds of physical impairments that make commuting really difficult, this this opening up of more remote work, of telework, has been a godsend in a lot of ways. And that's a real positive. And and the ADA is designed to kind of help people like that. So it's a complicated issue, no doubt. So Chris, from your perspective, what do you feel about this EEOC update and the technical assistance 2 weeks ago, and kind of the current landscape, and trying to project ahead? Because I think it was David, or all of you probably said this, make no mistake about it, that we're not going back to the way things were pre-pandemic vis-a-vis remote work. So the only question is exactly where are the lines?
Yeah, let me, I know you want me to look forward, but let me look backwards just a little bit and comment on a couple of things you and David have said. And first, what I want to say is that from my perspective, I think good employers have always viewed telework as a reasonable accommodation, even in situations where it might hinder or hamper the ability to perform one or more essential functions of the job. I know that when I was in private practice, and it's funny because I had the Ford case long before 2014, never went to court, never got to a charge, but I had that case involving somebody with IBS who took the job, and 2 weeks in said they had IBS and needed to work from home 5 days a week. And we worked very, 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 very hard with that individual to try to make that situation work. And I think all good employers would do that. So I don't think it's necessarily a new concept. Of course, it's got to be an individualized assessment. You've got to look at exactly what functions can be performed remotely versus what needs to or what requires the individual to come in to the office on a periodic basis. But I don't really view this as a terribly new concept. Looking forward, you're right. We all said it on the prep calls that we had, the 2 or 3 that we had. And I chuckle because I work for public utility. It's a company that's basically run by engineers, and engineers measure everything. And so we benchmark everything, and we benchmark things internally from one group to another, from one department to another. We benchmark issues externally with respect to other utilities, and we benchmark externally with respect to other large organizations. And you're absolutely right. Telework is here to stay. It's not going to go away. Employers are looking at it as an opportunity to save cost on rentals, office rentals, commercial space, things like that. And I think many companies have been surprised at how there really hasn't been a significant drop in production, at least with respect to the white collar workforce who are working on a remote basis, and how seamless the transition has been from most everybody going into the office every day to virtual opposite, most everybody working from home on a regular basis or working remotely, not necessarily from home. I know we're going to get to that later, but working remotely on a regular basis. I, for one, just speaking personally, I'm shocked at how productive I have been and how my team has been. I was not a fan of working from home, and I can count on one hand the number of times I worked from home over the last 10 years. And now I find myself 6 months into this process, and I'm not sure I want to go back to the office. But you're right. I think it's absolutely here to stay. Companies are expressing a strong interest in expanding this process, this telework process or remote work process, and we're not going to get away from it.
And we will come back to, because you alluded to that there is a legal distinction that matters between the exempt and the non-exempt employees in the complicating factors that arise with remote work. And there are also, when you mentioned white collar, there are some people where more of the functions might need to be in person than outside. But I want to go to another thing briefly before, Kathy, I get your perspectives on all of this topic. Off of what has been said so far by everybody, increased productivity, increased work hours, but, and we're going to get back to disparate impact later, we also had some conversations about what if you are, the caregiver for somebody? What if you are supervising the very rough, rocky, inconsistent online education of a fidgety elementary school child? And you can't get the nanny or the other caregiver for the child that you could get outside the pandemic. When we talk about increased productivity, is it increased productivity for everybody? I don't think so. I actually think there are some people who are finding it much harder to work right now remotely because of these conditions. And we've even seen some, it's been in the news, it's been in the media, there's been some intra-employee tension, sometimes from people who are non-parents complaining that they're having to shoulder more of the burden during this pandemic than the parents who are getting it easy, which I don't know if I agree with that at all, but that's out there. So I open this up to everyone, anybody who wants to speak to this. There are generalizations we can make, but then there are also, people being people. There are specific groups of people that are having a very different experience with this than others. Who wants to comment on that?
Well, I'll start. The thing is, it all depends so much on the individual, and many employers still have to have some kind of guideposts or matrices or people that they have to hit. And whether they hit it at a 9 to 5 time, or if they hit it from 7 to 9 and then from 4 until 9, That's the flexibility employers have to give to and have the productivity of its employees. There is a large number of people who cannot afford nannies, can't find nannies, or to have sitting there right when their child's being instructed. So the employer has to be more flexible. There's just no question. And I think a more flexible employer is going to have happier employees who are going to work and produce because they want to keep their job. And I don't see anything negative about that. Resentment by other employees, well, you can address that head on by saying, as a manager, you can address it and say, their productivity is just as good as yours. Their hours is just as good as yours, because many times, as we know, spreadsheets come out showing how much everybody's doing in comparison to other people in some of the industries. So I think that people can step up, and people are stepping up, and employers need to work with them.
Yeah, if I could jump in here too, Lauren, a couple of things to elaborate on what Kathy was saying and reinforce. When you say that it's up to the employer, I think you're right. It's up to the individual manager who is managing a group of people to be flexible about the work that's being done and when it is getting done. And then it's up to the employer as well to be flexible in terms of trying to provide some assistance to its employees. I'm not aware of any studies on this. Perhaps somebody else on the call is. But again, anecdotally, I know I can speak to the fact that many larger employers are creating more caregiver opportunities for their employees. My company being one of those companies that's doing that, to make caregiving more accessible to individuals who have to work remotely, but who have small children and can't work as well as homeschool, or can't work and take care of the video component of schooling all at the same time. So I just wanted to jump in and kind of elaborate on what Kathy was saying. I agree with what she said.
David, did you want to comment on that?
I'm not sure I have too much to add to the conversation on that.
Fair enough. And just for example, yesterday in the New York Times business section, there was an article about some employers really trying to, not limit it just, for example, to parenting or caregiving, but have a much more expansive paid leave or flexibility for whatever, reason is needed during this pandemic, and things like that. And another budding trend is to actually provide vouchers for caregiving help at an employer level. So that's an interesting concept. Before we just jump off of this telework as a reasonable accommodation, Kathy, you're the one who would be on the front line of getting the inquiry from somebody who's seeking the reasonable accommodation or felt that it had gone awry for telework as a reasonable accommodation. Anything else you want to add on that issue right now?
I think employers need, and they always have had to do this, and they haven't listened to their lawyers, but now they need to step up even more on the interactive process. That's what's really has to be engaged in between the employer and the employee. And I would hope now, and I would think now, that most employers are going to have a wider expanse as to what they will allow their employees to do. And now that they can see that in fact is happening. The problem is not every employee is a perfect employee. And I am sure employers are going to want to keep certain employees at the office every day, so they're totally watched over to make sure they're doing their job, whether an accommodation is needed or not, because they do not believe that employee is being productive. Some employees are not productive remotely. Sometimes people just can't not have the television on, or can't not answer their phone, and can't not eat multiple meals throughout the day. So it's going to be a bigger responsibility for the employer to engage in that interactive process. And I would think they probably should have very specialized people who have learned from the pandemic get involved in those discussions. And I think we will certainly see more remote work. What I'm curious about it, and I'd like to hear what other people think if it's appropriate,
Of course.
performance evaluations. How do you do performance evaluations now in this world, except based on numbers? Or, like the nuances, like, David talks about, like what somebody can contribute in a certain way is kind of missed. Interaction with your coworkers can be missed. So it'll be interesting to see what employers now do with performance evaluations and if somehow those morph into some other kind of form. And it's just a thought I've been having.
And there's another thread that we haven't really talked too much about, and I think that many of us are going through this as well, is that, there's a certain group of employees who actually want to be, for a variety of reasons. They want to go back into the physical space, and many employers are having a hard time absorbing them at this time just because of the absence of safety protocols, health and safety protocols. But I think that, I think this whole idea that work is work and home is home, is a pillar of American culture, and it's being eroded right now, I think, during the pandemic. And there are people who just say, look, when I'm home, I want to deal with the children. I want to deal with, the spouse. I want to have family time, and I want to go into the office. So I do have some faculty and staff members who I do see here because of they want this to be the workspace. And so I guess I'm just curious at sort of the flip side of this, in terms of whether other employers are seeing that in terms of employees who actually want to go into the office because they find it a little bit, and for some, it's just a better space, right? For some, it's just a better workspace, and we can't really forget about, digital divide issues. And, I think for certain, people who may be part of administrative staff and stuff, the workspace is a more productive space for them. And you have people who want to be in the actual building as a way to increase productivity or to maintain that line between work and family.
Well, Chris, I'll let you comment on that in a minute if you want. But first, I feel like I'm a salesperson here for other programs, but I'm part of the organizing committee for this wave of national college webinars. And the one that happened on, I believe it was Monday, was on return to on-site work issues. And it's an excellent webinar. And what the college is doing is posting these to the website after they've run. So if you missed that before and you're participating today, I highly recommend you take a look at it. Another quick comment, and we can maybe come back to this if we have time later, which I doubt, but I've even given some thought to think of the colossal amount of money that employers have invested in their real estate. And if there was really going to be a presumption that basically everybody could stay away afterwards, but the employer is locked into this very expensive lease for the next 5 or 10 years, what are they paying for? And whether that can be a legal justification in relationship to essential functions of the job, that's a fairly novel legal theory, but it wouldn't surprise me if we see that thrown out there. Chris, did you want to comment on this on-site versus remote tension that David was talking about?
I actually wanted to comment on what Kathy was talking about with respect to performance evaluations, if you don't mind.
Oh, of course.
And
I was going to make sure we got back there.
And again, yeah, not to make it about me, but as my wife says, I always like to make it about me. I just finished mid-year performance evaluations for my team, and just without, and as well as the rest of the company finished it up as well. And I like to think I have my finger on the pulse. I interact a lot with the folks in HR. I interact a lot with the folks in compensation. I interact a lot with other departments, and I didn't hear a lot of commentary about any difficulty with respect to doing mid-year reviews in a situation where we've been in the remote workspace for 5 or 6 months already. Again, I'll go back to what I was saying earlier about I think it's up to the individual manager and how much interaction the individual manager is having with his or her team in terms of keeping track of what's being done, who's doing it, and how well it's getting done. And that might be easier for lawyers, and it might be easier for other white collar positions. It may be harder in areas that I'm less familiar with on a day-to-day basis. But I know my colleagues and I had very, very little difficulty getting through that evaluation process. I do appreciate David's comments. You know, as accustomed as I am now to working from home, I do miss not going. I miss going into the office. I really do, and not so much with respect to the team that I work with, because trust me, I interact with them on a regular basis, daily, almost every single one of them. And I've got 10 people under me. And I interact with them on a regular basis in group meetings, individual settings, et cetera. So the interaction is there through video conferences. What I miss are the other 1,200 people who used to be in the building with me that I would, I wouldn't see all of them, but I saw a lot of them on a regular basis, walking down the hallway to get a cup of coffee, walking down the other hallway to go say hello to another attorney or an assistant. And I think that's what's missing, and that's the energy that's missing for people who are now teleworking. And that's really what I miss individually as well.
And just to Kathy, on the performance evaluation, and Chris was alluding to this, there was a trend pre-pandemic for performance evaluations to not rely so much on just the annual or the twice a year or even the quarterly, but a lot more of my clients were, at least as a complementary thing to that, adding a continuous, timely feedback encouragement, so that you finish a project, something happens of note, good, bad, or otherwise, you don't wait for the evaluation period to comment on it. And that was, that's good management outside of whether it's remote in the pandemic or not. But I think, to Chris's point, it's more important a manager that is actually losing touch with the people they're supervising when they're working remotely, especially during the pandemic. They're simply not doing their job, and that's bad management. And so I think that's a really important point. Let's get to disparate impact now. And Kathy, let's start with you. Can you discuss your perception that the pandemic and related socioeconomic turmoil has had a disparate impact on workers who are women, minorities, older, and poorer? And what legal ramifications do you believe such disparate impacts might have on employers?
Well, there's no question that women, Hispanics, African Americans, older individuals have been so much more greatly impacted by the pandemic. Everybody obviously has been affected by it. I mean, we all have been touched by it in some form, but we are the privileged class right here, all of us on this call. I mean, we have the education, we have the skills, we have the type of jobs we can do remotely. But how many people have the level of education we have, or have those skills, or have the ability to work remotely? The great percentage do not. I mean, we had, what, 13, I read a statistic today, there was the Bureau of Labor came out, 13 million people have applied for unemployment. I mean, that's astounding. And most of those people, I'm sure, are lower wage earners. Now let's talk about women, for example, well, as one classification. Well, first of all, also health-wise, socioeconomically disadvantaged people are contracting COVID-19 and dying at a much, much higher rate than us privileged people. And let's just be honest, we're privileged people. African Americans are dying at 2.4 times the number of white people. In Michigan, 40% of those deaths have been for African Americans, and yet African Americans only make up 22% of our population. So it's frightening. It's awful. There's lots of lots of explanations for it, such as high density living quarters, poor health, poor availability of health care, pre-existing conditions. There are a number of things, but we can't overlook the state of the health of individuals. But let's talk about the work situation. Women are more likely to have lost their jobs and less likely to be hired for new ones. The statistics are all showing this. Globally, women make up 39% of the employment workforce, but account for 54% of overall job losses since the pandemic hit. So women are, and because why? Because many of them are in industries such as tourism, restaurants, hotels, those types of industries which have been hard hit, or they're part-time employees, and part-time employees have been hard hit. Sometimes in family situations, families make the decision it's easier for the wife to stay home and homeschool the children and give up her job than the husband. Then we end up with the violence and the domestic abuse issues, which isn't related to employment, but those are all things that are impacting society. So that's very difficult. Let's talk about Latinos and African Americans. I mean, African Americans are losing jobs. The unemployment rate for whites, Caucasians is below 10%. Latinos is 10.5%. Asians is 10.7%. African Americans is 13%. I mean, and if you look at the percentages of our population, those are horrific numbers to show what impact it's having on what I have. But the industries that employ, the manufacturing sector, for example, employs over 13 million workers. How many manufacturing jobs can be done remotely? Very, very few. The managers maybe, or higher up supervisors, but the people who are on the line cannot work remotely, and they're the ones going into work and putting their lives literally at risk by being in, even no matter how many masks you wear and socially distance, there's a greater likelihood they're going to contract COVID. The construction industry has been hurt greatly. Who are the individuals in the construction industry? Generally Latinos and African Americans. So we have a huge impact. The other thing we miss out, and we have to look at, is the hotel industry. The hotel industry has been especially impacted. They're saying that they don't believe they'll be back to what they were pre-COVID till 2023. Now, who works generally in the hotel industry? It's the hourly employees that are taking the brunt. And who are the hourly employees? They're the housekeepers, they're the line cooks, and other people working in the industry, mostly African American and Latinos, and they have lost their jobs. Now, what can employers do? So, and then older workers, let's go there before we talk about what can be done. Older workers, the baby boomers who you say are doing so well, and I'll tell you, there's been a severe effect in the U.S. on older workers because of preconceived notions. Again, we're fighting the same kind of things that we have fought for years about older employees. They don't know how to organize certain things. They don't know how to use technology. They're not computer savvy, and they're not digitally savvy. So employers are reducing the older employees and keeping younger ones. Seniority is basically out the window, although it's been out the window for a long time, except for unions. I understand that. But it's also forced a lot of older workers to go into involuntary retirement. And you can just see the numbers, and you see that when there's a perception that older people are less flexible, less technologically orientated, and they're more expensive in the workplace because they've been there longer, they are the first to go. And also with the cost of healthcare, I mean, there's just a number of things. So we really are seeing a disparate impact on older older individuals, African Americans, women, Latinos, and Native Americans. So the three of you are doing really well on this call, but and I am too, but that's because of my privilege. But
Oh,
employers,
and and I'm sorry to interrupt for a second, but just I want to make the point that actually that survey from the commercial real estate broker that I referred to, I think it actually supports you. It in no way contradicts you, because it was only responses from people who were still in their job and working remotely.
right,
So it didn't speak to the disparate impact and loss of jobs for older workers, and B, it disproves those stereotypes about older workers being inflexible and not technologically savvy, because they were reporting that they were being more effective working remotely. So I actually think it supported what you were saying. But and you were going to now speak about what employers could do and what the legal ramifications might be.
well, and one of the things is employers are doing severance packages generally, some kind of severance packages. So people are scared in this pandemic, so they're more likely to take severance packages, whether if they even if they think they have a discrimination case or they're being treated discriminatorily. I mean, I've seen that repeatedly in the past few months. But one thing that's going on, which you know, I'm hoping will fall over into other industries, the hotel industries, mostly the unions in certain cities, are pushing for a right to return work. That is, once the jobs do return, that the individuals who held them will have the first right to return at the same salary they were at. And that has been done in, there's a push on it now in Philadelphia, Las Vegas, and New York. It's already in place in Los Angeles and California. We're not surprised with those geographic areas. But things like that, you know, employers have to be aware of these issues, and we need to make the workplace safe for for minorities, because you know, many of us hear horror stories about what's going on there. The government says you're supposed to do X, Y, and Z, and some employers aren't doing it. And then if the employee goes to OSHA, or in my state, my OSHA, bad things happen under whistleblowers. So employers have to be more aware of what's going on and the advances that we've made over the years for people of color, for women, for older people. We're taking big steps back, and employers have to be aware to make sure that those folks are protected.
Others want to comment?
Yeah, let me jump in, and I think that was beautifully said, Kathy. And I think that this is really one of the most critical and urgent issues of our time, because I think what we see is really the amplification of inequalities that existed before the pandemic, but have been completely amplified during the pandemic. Because, as you mentioned, you know, I think people in the information economy like us, you know, our savings accounts are going up because we're not spending money, and you know, and we have jobs and we're safe, and we don't really, you know, have to worry about going to work and facing infection and potential death of members of the family. But you know, concurrently, you know, there was a recent article in the New Yorker about the transit workers in New York City, right? And just about the number of transit workers who have died of COVID. And one of the beautiful things that happened in this area, you know, was at 7 p.m. there was always a recognition of the essential workers and the frontline workers, the healthcare workers, the transit workers, people who are working in grocery stores. But despite that recognition, you know, I think that the dangers to the essential workers have become more and more heightened, right? And if you start talking about agriculture, transit workers, meat packing, you know, where you've had really high incidence of COVID, you're talking about communities of color. And that presents a really, really different set of issues than some of those that we started talking about today. And certainly, you know, something that I want to start looking at, and then we're going to do, you know, speaker series at Rutgers on a lot of those issues as well. But I think there's a really deep, almost existential issue that we're going through right now, and that is that because we're in our homes, you know, these issues are not in our faces unless we're living them. And that means that as we, you know, as we live our lives and on one Zoom call after another, you know, the food lines of Newark are not something that you see unless you're in the food lines of Newark, right? And then the cascading effects, like I'm in the school right now, but the three big employers in the central business district, Prudential, Audible, and Rutgers University, they're all hollowed out at this point, and that means that the Cuban restaurant on the corner and the Irish bar and all the people who work there and the diners that I used to go to and all the people that used to work there are really struggling, right? I mean, they're really, really struggling with either unemployment or underemployment. And it's just really, I think, useful for all of us who do this work, to make sure that we can always step outside of ourselves. And I know that Chris has to deal with these issues. These are issues that are part of his employment relationship, part of his job responsibilities. But I just think as citizens, to kind of turn our back on these issues at our enormous peril, because it is really completely amplified now in really, I think, extreme ways. And the question is, how do we get back from that?
Yeah,
Not career.
Lauren, let me
Of course, Chris.
just to jump in here for a sec. Yeah, I can't argue with anything that Kathy or David has said. I would simply add that it's heartbreaking to hear the stories that I've heard and friends and colleagues have heard in terms of what's going on out there, and from my coworkers as well, and people that I work with and their family and friends and relatives and things like that. I feel very fortunate to work for an organization that I do think takes its role in society very seriously, not just in terms of the service that we provide, but also in terms of the obligation that we feel we have to our workforce. And without getting into a lot of detail, we have done a lot of the things. We've done right by our workforce in terms of how we're addressing this issue, and doing everything that we can to make sure that our workers are not adversely impacted in any way.
At this point, we go from, I think, rightfully. I mean, first of all, for the college, and the college is experienced labor and employment practitioners who also believe in collegiality and things. I think if you practice an L&E, you're a people person. You care about people, regardless of which side, which classification you're on. And so rightfully, I think these are issues that are impactful and even emotion laden. And nothing speaks emotion laden more than wage and hour, as I'm now going to pivot. If you were wondering where I was going with that, but I do think it's important. And this relates in perhaps for some people unforeseen ways to everything we talked about before. But especially for non-exempt workers, there are a whole raft of ramifications, complicated legal issues related to remote work. So starting with you, Chris, given your role, can you just walk us through some of these wage and hour ramifications, such as off the clock work, continuous workday, breaks, expense reimbursement? What makes these issues more complicated for non-exempt workers in a remote setting?
What makes it complicated is that it's a remote setting, and whereas in the past, when you were all at the same location or facility, you could observe what was going on, and if it wasn't being observed, people were either punching a time clock or entering information into a system or swiping a card that would allow them to enter and exit the facility. And so there were ways to track, how long people were working, what time they were taking breaks, when they were leaving the building, when they were coming back, if you needed to. And that system pretty much broke down as of March 12th or 13th. because there were no longer any time cards to punch or swipe cards to put in front of a monitor that would allow you to see what people were doing. You know, again, without getting into specifics, we're doing our best to track all of that internally at the company. One of the advantages we have, quite frankly, is that our workforce, our non-exempt workforce, is heavily unionized, and they are not working remote in the same way that office workers are working on a remote basis. So with respect to these issues, I'd say the majority of the employees are doing a lot of things that they had been doing previously, which is punching a time clock, taking prescribed breaks, and we're able to track it. It's really the office workers that we're struggling a little bit with, and I haven't seen a strong solution just yet, other than good management and managers and supervisors doing everything they can to make sure that people aren't working 50-hour weeks, not taking breaks, and you know, having managers or employers abuse the system.
And this is another thing that's in the handouts today, is a PowerPoint presentation on the wage and hour considerations that was prepared by one of my Sci-5 colleagues. But and Kathy had mentioned earlier, and I think it was an appropriate point about, you know, if somebody has, for example, a child at home that they need to help with schooling, an employer having the flexibility, rather than it being 9 to 5, to let them work 7 to 9, then take a break to help with the schooling, and then just finish up later. And if it amounts to the same amount of time, that you know, and that works with, you know, the essential functions of the job, that makes sense. But there is this doctrine, the continuous workday doctrine, both at the federal level and at a lot of state and local levels. Now, the feds, the USDOL, did put out some guidance recently in the pandemic to try to recognize an exception. But in brief, for those of you who aren't full-time wage and hour practitioners, the concept is meant to protect non-exempt employees, and says that if you start doing, you know, integral functions of your job at a certain point in time, and then they're interrupted for little periods of time, that you should be deemed to be working from when you started until the end. And that you are, and that the employer could be obligated under those circumstances to pay you for that full span of hours during the continuous workday. Now you apply that to this kind of situation where you have somebody who, you know, wants to take that break to help their child with their schoolwork. How do you fit that in with the continuous workday? And that's difficult, but probably even more difficult is what if somebody's is sort of working, but is very distracted while they're trying to help. I think the answer to that is for a non-exempt employee, the employer needs to pay them for that time. But that, if it becomes a big problem over time, can really lead to all kinds of complications. And where I'm going with this is, Chris was mentioning that it's easier to track people's time when they're on site. There are also much less distractions on site. People, by and large, unless they need a service animal as a reasonable accommodation, are not bringing their pets to on-site work. They don't have their personal fridge with all its goodies, you know, on site. You know, they don't have all the screens and the TV and those kinds of things. So these are very complicated issues, and I will tell you that some of my clients have actually been purchasing and starting to use very sophisticated software to monitor the electronic communications of these non-exempt employees to try to deal with this issue. And, you know, you can understand their motivation for doing so, but that also doesn't necessarily feel great, that if somebody's working in their home, they have, you know, this big brother system monitoring them all the time. So Kathy, from your perspective, and I know that you said that while you don't do a lot of wage and hour work in your private practice, that as a mediator, you do mediate these things. Have you been seeing this bubble up yet? And what are your thoughts on the future of these difficult wage and hour issues in a remote setting?
Well, we all know that the cases are going to be brought. It just depends on how the courts and employers are going to handle it. I mean, I see the biggest issue for an employer is if somebody is at home keeping track of their hours, and the employer keeps sending out messages saying, don't work overtime, don't work overtime, don't work overtime, but they still do, what you got to pay them. And unless you have this savvy software product, you're vulnerable. So it's a very hard situation for an employer. There's no question about it. And people are more savvy now to keep track of their time records. So good luck. Sorry, I don't mean to be so flip, but it's a hard issue for employers. Clearly a hard issue.
But I'm wondering again, if we need to use a one size fits all kind of approach, because I think that, certainly before the pandemic, there were employees who had constant interruptions, right? Often from home. I know I certainly brought my kids to work, and, I was an exempt employee, but my kids were at work all the time during depositions and whatever. And so, I'm not sure if we're necessarily dealing with a new problem. And I'm just wondering if even empirically we're dealing with a much more compounded problem now than we were dealing with before, because we're always going to have the interruptions, and I think all of us know that people are going to do the, did you see The Bachelor last night and spend 30 minutes on that, right? And or talk about whatever local sports team you have, and spend 30 minutes on that, or just get into various conversations. And in some respects, those are distractions you don't have now. Now maybe you have the kiddies, or you have your refrigerator or your TV or whatever. But I'm just wondering if we're really, to me, there's a real empirical question here in terms of how people are working, and whether I think we started when we started out with the premise that people are working harder, but it sounds like almost the premise here is that maybe there are more distractions for the non-exempt employee, and they're not working as hard. I think the whole privacy issues that are implicated by the monitoring software are very profound, and I think employers should really think through what they're doing on this, because it's going to have some very deep blowback and implications.
And then how do you keep track of lunch times, break time? Those are, people are probably popping up for breaks more often than ever, because it's so easy just to walk 2 feet to the refrigerator or are they really?
Don't I know it?
Yeah, the COVID-19, they've been calling it, right? And I think employers just have to document and instruct as best they can, and say, these are the rules. You can't violate these rules. You got to do this. It's for everybody's own good, and you have to take a break. And I'll tell you, I think one thing people are missing is the physical impact on people being home and doing work remotely. I mean, I am so sick of sitting in front of a computer. I'm now molded to my office desk for Zoom meetings rather than walking around and doing stuff. And you can't go to the kitchen in the office, and you can't do this. And it is physically taxing to be remote, if you are doing your job. So I think people are missing that. And I think that could lead to comp claims and all sorts of stuff, which I know it's not wage and hour, but I see all sorts of things coming from this.
Absolutely. Hopefully you can get from this. We don't have answers, to some of these questions at the edges, but there are a lot of unanticipated things here. I will even say that, and this can become rather academic, but could an employer, in determining who gets to work remotely or not, and dealing with even telework as a reasonable accommodation, given the extra complications for non-exempt employees, could those complications become a justification for on-site being an essential job function. Now, I think some academics would say that no, that's not what essential job function means. But at a practical level, you can understand the urge of employers to make that argument. And also, as another practical thing, if the legal answer becomes, the academics win on that and no, that isn't something for an essential function of the job, it's possible some of those non-exempt jobs might go away because the complicating factors are so great for employers. So these, we're just at the beginning of the story that's going to be written on this. And even related to this, I'm going to go to something that maybe is even drier than the wage an hour, but is important on the unanticipated consequences. And Chris, I'll start with you to the extent you feel comfortable commenting. What are your considerations as an employer about the new locations of remote work potentially subjecting you to the requirements of new jurisdictions in areas such as tax and workers' compensation? In other words, if you're allowing somebody to work remotely and they're going to live with their parents in California, or they're going here or they're going there, what we're starting to see is those jurisdictions claim legal authority in these areas. So what are the legal ramifications for you?
Gee, thanks, Lauren. It's a dry area, but it's complicated. It's something that we had to start thinking about right away in the middle of a very, very hectic transition from on-site work to remote work, and dealing with the avalanche of new laws that were coming down, and how we were going to deal with remote workers and our essential workers and everything else. We created an internal team to think about these issues as well. What are we missing? What are the unintended consequences of having everybody work remotely? And you look at our our roster, and we have people working in the New York metropolitan area. So that includes New York, New Jersey, Connecticut. Then you go a little bit further, we have a fair number of people working in Pennsylvania and Delaware. And then you start talking to people who are working remotely, and you find out that they went down to South Carolina or went to visit their kids in California, and are staying with their kids in California, or their parents in California, or that they're staying with their mom in Grenada. And that's an actual situation that occurred. So, from a tax perspective, how do you deal with withholding when somebody is working on a regular basis from a different, within a different jurisdiction? And luckily our tax folks are addressing that issue. And at first we didn't know how long this was going to last. So if it's just a couple of weeks or a month or two, maybe it's not that big a deal and we don't have to focus on it. But once you hit that 6 to 8 week period, you realize, okay, this is a significant issue and this is something we're going to have to look at. So, we start withholding for people who are working out of the state. We're withholding pursuant to that state. The workers' comp issue is a lot more complicated. It's a lot more complicated as to whether or not, because you have to get an insurance policy to cover workers' compensation. And is that, if we have individuals working in 40 out of 50 states, does that mean an employer has to have an insurance policy covering each of those 40 states? Really, really, really good question. There aren't any answers. There really aren't any answers, because they're still working for an entity that is based in one state. So it's very, very complicated. There are no answers, at least as far as I can tell right now. We're working through the issue to try to come up with answers to that particular question.
Can I jump in, Lauren?
Of course.
First of all, in Detroit, we have a city of Detroit tax, and the city they've already said how many millions of dollars they're going to lose just by people doing remote work because they're not doing it in the city. So that's an issue. But we also have situations like if someone goes from New York, well, maybe New York, you're such liberal, from Michigan, let's say, where we don't have such liberal laws, you go to work remotely in California. Well, California's got all these different rules about breaks and times and all that. And do they apply to those people? I mean, we're talking about different laws and applying them. I mean, maybe in the future, we'll be talking about if a reasonable accommodation is such that, yeah, you can work remotely, but this is the geographical area you have to be in to do your remote work. We might we might get there.
No, and sticking with California, so California in employment law and in other areas of the law, but particularly employment law, is the most vigorous in the country at exercising long-arm jurisdiction. They've taken the position that, if you fly in there for one meeting for 2 hours and the other 364 days and 0.8, you're working somewhere else, that you could still be subject to California law. So, and this is related to wage and hour, among the California things are that it's one of the only states where you're obligated to reimburse for all reasonable and necessary business expenses. So if somebody moves to California temporarily during the pandemic and your normal policy wouldn't be to reimburse them for certain things, you could be obligated to during this. Absolutely. So mentioning California is very apt. And I'll mention to Chris's point about how unresolved this is, as we're nearing the end of our time. I raised in the prep calls, and I'll be honest with everybody on this, we don't know the answer, and there really is. I had some preliminary research done. There's no clear guidepost on this, but if it's such a great expense for an employer, if they're allowing people to work remotely, to have them subject to so many jurisdictions requirements and the expenses of that, can an employer lawfully restrict the location from which somebody does remote work? Now, David was mentioning earlier, and I, as personally a civil libertarian, this, all this monitoring software gives me the heebie-jeebies too. There's also this notion about, basically you should be able to live where you want to live, and some states have lawful off-duty conduct statutes. But we're talking about a significant expense and significant legal complications for employers, for populations that they allow to work remotely, if they allow them to work in foreign jurisdictions like Chris mentioned or something like that. None of my co-panelists wanted to take that question on for an answer because there isn't a clear answer right now, but we did think it was worthwhile to highlight for all of you, all of these broader ramifications. So by my calculation, we only have 2 or 3 minutes left. I just wanted to give my terrific co-panelists another chance for any parting thoughts. Anybody want to go first?
Well, good luck to everybody in terms of how we deal with this. There's going to be a lot of cases coming out of it, I believe, moving forward. And I think employers are tasked with a very difficult job. However, I believe that they have the tools available to work out with their employees. And I really do believe the interactive process will be much more robust than it has been in the past.
Yep. Agreed.
And thank you, Lauren, for getting us organized, and thank you to the college for hosting this. I think the college is really a very critical body right now in terms of addressing many of these rapidly emerging issues, but also, as we discussed earlier, even though I'm sure, most of the members of the college are working on their Zoom calls and working at home, not really be lulled into believing that everything is okay with our workers, because it's not. There's tremendous problems going on in our country right now, and they relate to the issues that the college deals with. So we need to really step up.
Yeah, and Lauren,
yes.
I'm sorry. Just quickly, I want to thank you and the college for asking me to participate. And yeah, I really enjoyed. I know you, and I enjoyed working with David and Kathy. And even though we may not have had all of the answers or even a lot of the answers, I think we highlighted a lot of issues that employment lawyers need to be thinking about.
Well, thank you all so much. And the last important thing, the CLE code, SS as in Seyfarth Shaw 1332. That's SS 1332. Remember, the form is in your handouts and the email to which you send it is at the bottom of the form. I really thank you to the panelists and thank you to the participants, and have a great day.
Thank you, Lauren.
Thanks.
Yep.